Okay, we are going to pick up where we left off with Chapter 2, starting with the production function here. And the production function is going to tell us how much output we can generate from additional units of input. So when we apply this to sports, what might our output be? Our output could be attendance, could be TV ratings. When we think about on-the-field performance, output for most sports is going to be wins. That's what we're trying to accomplish. And from a strictly Moneyball standpoint, that output is the focus. And when we think about how we're going to produce wins, in most sports it's going to be a function of your total offense and your total defense. Of course, offense is going to help you produce points that lead to wins. Defense is going to hopefully help you stop the other team or your opponent from scoring points. So some function of that is going to determine your number of wins. So a couple terms that you're probably familiar with, or hopefully familiar with, that we need to be reminded of here. Marginal product. So your marginal product would be how much offensive talent, for example, does it take to produce a 1 unit increase in wins. And you see the equation here, marginal product for talent on offense is equal to the change in wins divided by the change in offensive talent. That's the ratio that gives us the marginal product that we're interested in. Then if we look at marginal cost, what's the cost of producing one more unit? So in this case that would be wins. How much does it cost us to try and capture one more win? And we see that equation here, marginal cost equals your change in cost over your change in quantity of output. So if this change in quantity of output is 1, if we're trying to get one more win, that would mean the denominator in this equation is 1. And then whatever our change in cost is to achieve that one more win would be our marginal cost. So when we look at these two equations, we can ask ourselves, what's the relationship here between marginal product and marginal cost? And you'll notice that in the numerator of our marginal product equation is the change in quantity of wins. In our marginal cost equation, that change in quantity is in the denominator, which will tell us, hey, there must be an inverse relationship here between marginal cost and marginal product, and indeed there is. And the reason for that is because more productive inputs are going to add to output more cheaply. So let's look at a graph, and I think this might become a little bit more clear. And let's use football to talk about an example here, American football. So first of all, we have marginal product on the left here, and we have marginal cost on our right graph here. The first thing to notice is these slopes of these curves are inverse of each other. Like we just said, marginal product and marginal cost are inversely related. So now let's focus on the marginal product curve here. And let's again think about this in terms of American football as an example. So on the bottom axis here, the horizontal axis, we have offensive talent. As we add offensive talent, we're moving to the right on this axis. Our vertical axis here is the marginal product, or what's the additional wins that we're achieving with the addition of offensive talent. And you can see as we move and add more and more talent, as we move to the right in this slope, we see that talent is adding more and more wins, and then at a certain point we reach a crest here and we start to slope downward on our marginal product curve. And this downward slope means we're still adding talent, we're still moving to the right on this horizontal axis, but we're moving down on the vertical axis, meaning we're still above zero. It's our 0 point. We're still operating in the positive range here, so we're still adding wins as we add more talent, but we're adding less and less wins as we add additional talent. Okay, now what might be the reason for this? Why does the curve slope in this fashion? Well, let's think about a team that doesn't have very much offensive talent. They're down in this range on the left part of this axis of talent. If you don't have very much offensive talent and you add offensive talent, it's contributing a lot to your team because you didn't have very much offensive talent to begin with. So you're gaining a lot of marginal product, you're gaining a lot of wins in this case just by adding additional offensive talent when you don't have very much. But you get to the point where you've got a decent amount of talent on offense, and adding additional talent still makes you better. It still adds marginal product, it still adds wins, but at a decreasing rate. This is what you might have already figured out, diminishing returns coming into play here. So if I, out here at this end of the curve, if I already have a pretty good quarterback, let's say I am let's say the Green Bay Packers. I have Aaron Rodgers as my quarterback, Hall of Fame quarterback. That's a lot of offensive talent. If I add an additional quarterback, is that really going to gain me very many more wins? Well, it might, because we know that quarterbacks get injured on occasion, and having a pretty good backup could pick up a win or two for you. But it's not adding the additional marginal product that it would be if, say, the Browns, who are maybe down here on offensive talent, add Aaron Rodgers as their quarterback, or I shouldn't say Aaron Rodgers, add a pretty good quarterback, then their additional marginal product added by adding that offensive talent is all the way up here. And so that's why we see this diminishing returns. Or that's why we see this curve slope downward, because of diminishing returns. Now let's look at marginal cost. Okay, now on the horizontal axis we have wins. Okay, if I don't have very many wins, if I'm down in this part of the axis, let's say like the Browns, the poor Browns. I'm from Northeast Ohio. I keep picking on them. I actually feel bad for them. But they haven't been very good over the last 10 years. Let's say that they don't have very much. They don't have very many wins. So the marginal cost of them gaining an additional win, going from 4 to 5 wins, let's say, or 5 to 6 wins, that marginal cost is going down as they move toward maybe 7 or 8 wins, and then all of a sudden wins start to get more expensive. Adding that additional talent to gain wins out in this part of the axis costs a lot, because now you've got to add really good players to get you that 9th, 10th, 11th win. We're operating all the way out here on our wins axis, our units of output. We're trying to output wins here, and our marginal cost is way up here, meaning it costs a lot to get those wins out in the 11, 12, 13 range. So hopefully that example helps you understand how marginal product and marginal cost are inversely related and why those curves slope in the way that they do. Now let's talk a little bit about market structure. So we started out in Chapter 1 thinking a little bit about sports economics and maybe why we need a separate course for economics in sports. Economists in general like to assume that there's perfect competition or close to it in a particular industry or in a particular marketplace. That makes for a nice, clean analysis. But in most markets, there's not perfect competition, but some markets are a lot closer to perfect competition than others. So let's talk about perfect competition for a minute, and then we'll consider how close sports is to a perfect competition market. And let me say that we're not talking about competition in terms of on-the-field competition here. We're talking about business competition. So competing for customers and competing to sell product. So in order to have perfect competition, we need a lot of producers and a lot of consumers that are buying and selling products that are relatively the same, right? Homogeneous products. Because if we have these first 2 points, then that means that if we have these first 2 points, that means that we're going to also have the third point here. That no firm, a supplier, and no customer can alter the market price. Meaning a firm could change their own price, but when they do that, they're going to lose a lot of their consumers or all of their consumers because, again, there's many producers. And so their customers are going to go to another producer because the products are homogeneous in this marketplace, right? So an individual firm can't alter the market price, and a consumer, because there's lots of consumers, any individual consumer can't alter the market price either. Another assumption here is that buyers and sellers both have really good information. That's been helped a lot by the internet and our ability as consumers to go to the internet and gain a lot of product information and compare products. And we're also going to, in a perfect competition market, assume that firms can freely enter and exit the market. And this particular assumption is important because if a firm tries to alter the market price, by raising their prices a lot, then competitors or customers are going to go to their competitors. When that firm loses all of their customers, they're going to exit that marketplace, right? Conversely, if a market is really profitable, meaning the market price is set at a level where the suppliers are making a lot of money, then firms are going to recognize that, individuals, entrepreneurs are going to recognize that, hey, this is a really good market to make lots of profits in. They're going to enter that market. That's going to shift the supply curve to the right because demand slopes down, if we remember. Shifting the supply curve to the right is going to lower the equilibrium price, means it's going to make that market a little bit less profitable than it used to be because now we have more competitive firms entering the market, and it's going to result in a lower price for us as consumers. So it's beneficial to consumers that not any single firm can alter the market price. So you see how these different assumptions work together to create this idea of perfect competition where an equilibrium price is arrived at without any individual producer or consumer being able to influence it too much and take advantage of each other. So now, does this type of competition describe business and sports, or the market in the sports industry? Do we have a lot of producers and a lot of consumers? Well, we have a lot of consumers. How many professional sports producers do we have in the U.S.? Well, we've got several different leagues, so we have a lot in that regard. Do they have homogeneous products? I'd say not necessarily. I'd say the product of professional baseball is quite a bit different than the product of professional football. So they're not really buying and selling a homogeneous product. They're also not in the same marketplace as each other, with a few exceptions like New York and LA. Here in Cincinnati, we only have one professional baseball team. We only have one professional football team. It's stipulated by the league themselves. Our sports industry in the U.S. Primarily operates with closed leagues, which means that each team or franchise in the league has a certain marketplace exclusivity, again with just a few exceptions, and typically those exceptions are in different divisions or different leagues For example, the New York Football Giants playing in the NFL or the NFC, and the Jets playing in the AFC. So I would say that because of those reasons, and because this last assumption of a perfectly competitive market, that firms can freely enter and exit the market, that's definitely violated in sports. We couldn't produce a professional baseball team and freely enter the professional baseball market. Certainly not at the major league level, because Major League Baseball would never allow that. We do have the Florence Freedom, but they don't operate. They don't operate in any of the minor leagues that are affiliated with Major League Baseball. So they're not a AAA, AA, or single A team. They're an independent league team, so they're below all of those, which means that even as baseball goes, certainly not a homogeneous product. I wouldn't say the Florence Freedom is the same as going to a Cincinnati Reds game. So perfect competition, I would say, does not describe the market in professional sports, and economists would generally share that same opinion. So before we think about how price is determined in the sports industry, let's think about how it would be determined if we did have perfect competition. So how would price be related to marginal revenue where there's perfect competition? So marginal revenue, again, is the revenue that I make for each additional product that I sell, quantity of product that I sell. Marginal revenue would be the same as price, right? Because that price I would take in and count as revenue to me every time I sold a product. So we see that indeed in this graph here, we see the marginal revenue line is equal to price. Every time I sell an additional quantity of output, I make an additional marginal revenue here. So what output would I like to have in this perfect competition market? What output would I like to have that would maximize my profit? Well, my marginal cost curve is here. I'm going to continue to sell quantities of my output as long as I have this gap here, right? Because this gap represents what? It represents my profit. It's the difference between my marginal revenue and my marginal cost. However, once I get past this point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, anything that I sell out here in terms of quantity, I still have to sell at this price, because remember, this is perfect competition. I can't determine the price. It's determined by the marketplace. I'm selling it, this is my marginal revenue, but at this quantity of output, my marginal cost is up here. I'm losing money when I'm selling additional units past the point where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost. So my output that's going to maximize profit, my output that maximizes profit is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, where these are equal to each other, which is this point right here. So what about a monopoly? That's like the opposite of perfect competition. So in a monopoly situation, our assumption of there being homogeneous products sold by different producers is false. We only have one producer in a monopoly. It's a unique product. There's nobody else. There's no other substitute. And that gives the producer a lot of market power, right? Because as a consumer, I can't go anywhere else to buy this particular product. This might be the case with Major League Baseball in Greater Cincinnati. If I want to go to a game, now I can watch other games on television, but if I want to attend a game in person, I only have one choice. The Cincinnati Reds have a monopoly. If I live in LA, or if I live in New York, it's a slightly different situation, right? I have two options, two different teams I could see. Chicago, I have two different teams, professional baseball teams I can go and see. So it's not a perfect monopoly. But I probably don't have, I certainly don't have a situation where individual firms can enter and exit the market as they want to. However, over in Europe, we do have that situation, right? You can't immediately start a Premier League team, but you can start a professional soccer team in a particular area in England, and over the course of time you can move up through the leagues because of the promotion and relegation system. You can be promoted to different leagues, and you can eventually have a Premier League team, which somewhat explains why we have 5 or 6 Premier League teams all in the London area, because that many teams have been started in that area, and those teams have moved up through the levels, been promoted, and made it into Premier League. So because that assumption of a homogeneous product being sold by many producers is false, the monopoly producer has market power, and that producer, that firm, can raise prices without losing all their customers. So the Reds could raise their prices. They might lose some customers, and how many they lose would be dependent on the elasticity of demand. But they would not lose all their customers because their customers have no other producer to go to. So certain customers would stick with that producer. If it was perfect competition and a firm raised their prices, all their customers would go to the competitor that had the same product in the same marketplace. A firm would lose all those customers, but that doesn't happen here. So why don't competitors enter the market? Well, in our Major League Baseball example, of course, we've got significant barriers to entry. You have to have the league agree, all the owners, which make up the votes in the league, all the other owners have to agree to allow you in as an expansion franchise. And that is extremely unlikely to happen in Major League sports. It does happen in a few cases, and usually expansion happens where there's a particular market, geographic market, and there's no existing team in that market, and the league determines that, hey, we can make more money for the league by putting a team here, even though we have to split the revenues with more teams because you're adding an expansion team. The additional revenue that we're going to get by putting a team in this market is going to be over and above the cost to the other owners of splitting the revenue with an additional team. So we've got those high barriers to entry. And of course we have other barriers to entry before you could even get the league to consider you as an expansion franchise. You've got to build a stadium. You've got to have an ownership structure that they feel like is going to support the team over the long term. And you've got a few other barriers as well. And even if we think about, let's think about soccer for a minute, because you might say, if you're familiar with soccer and MLS and the Cincinnati marketplace at all, well, FC Cincinnati, they're an expansion franchise and they're trying to enter the Major League Soccer market, but even they don't, it's not a perfectly competitive situation where they can enter at their own will this market. They were granted an expansion franchise in the minor league USL. They've been very successful so far. They're going to try and accomplish some goals to make them more attractive to Major League Soccer, but ultimately it's up to this group of owners in Major League Soccer to decide who they're going to allow in as expansion franchises. It's not based on pure competition in the marketplace. And as we discussed before, in a perfect competition situation, your maximum profit is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You don't want to go beyond that point because then you're starting to lose money, but all the way up to that point you're adding to your profit. So what about in a monopoly situation? Does that still hold true? Well, it does hold true, but the difference here is that our marginal revenue curve is going to be actually below the demand line. It's going to be less than the price that you're selling the tickets at. Now, why is that the case? This is kind of a tricky situation to understand. So we're going to make some assumptions to simplify the situation a little bit here and simplify the discussion. So let's assume that all the tickets cost the same in a stadium. Let's take Coors Field in Colorado. That's the example that they use in the textbook. we'll assume that all the tickets cost the same and all of the tickets are equally have equal entertainment value or equal utility to fans, right? So it doesn't matter where you sit, the product is equal. The benefit that you get from that product is equal. All right, so let's look at this graph here. So Coors Field has about 50,000 people in it. Our marginal cost curve looks like vertical at 50,000. And if you look closely, you'll see that the marginal cost curve is at 0 all the way up to 50,000 and then takes a sharp turn up. You might have figured out already. That's because the capacity of Coors Field is 50,000. There's virtually no additional cost to selling another ticket if you're under 50,000. Tickets involve very little variable cost, if any at all. So my marginal cost of selling an additional ticket is 0, so that's why it's 0 until I get to that 50,000, and then the marginal cost skyrockets. It's almost vertical because I got to add to my stadium or I got to build a new stadium, right? So that's why we see a marginal cost curve that looks like this. Demand is here, so our demand line is right here. You see this signified with the D. So, for instance, there are about 37,000 people that are willing to pay $8 a ticket, let's say, to go to this game. Probably a little bit higher than that in actuality in terms of the ticket price, demand, but let's just say $8. Now, if I wanted to sell out the stadium, I could go all the way to 50,000. I could look at where my marginal cost curve is, go all the way until I cross it with demand, and that would be at $3 a ticket, right? So in order to get that extra 13,000, I've got to lower my ticket price from $8 to $3 to get that extra 13,000 people. However, in this assumption where all tickets are priced the same and all tickets have the same utility, when I lower my ticket price from $8 to $3, I can't just do it for that extra 13,000, because all of these 37,000 people that have bought at $8, they're going to be pretty upset that I just sold 13,000 tickets to people that only paid $3, right? Because they paid $8. And while that would work for a game or two, those people, 37,000, are going to stop coming to my game and stop paying $8 because they know other people are getting it for $3, right? So over time, what happens is, in order to get out here in a monopoly situation, I have to reduce the price for all the previous units that were sold, which means that although my demand is out here, my marginal revenue actually splits from the demand line. It's not a very good, well, I'm not doing a very good job with my drawing here, but I think you get the idea. So there's this gap here, meaning that selling additional tickets out here mean I'm actually giving back all of these sales, giving back money in these sales, or I'm lowering the price beyond what the demand would indicate. I'm actually selling it at a lower price than what the demand is for these fans out here in order to add additional tickets sold. So my marginal revenue line is below my demand line, and I am going to probably focus on this point as a monopolist. I'm going to, because this is where my marginal revenue line crosses marginal costs, and I'm going to sell 37,000 tickets at $8 a pop here. Right? So I look at where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost, and then I go up the demand line to see how much I can charge, and it's $8. And if we take $8 times 37,000, what do we get? We get like 296,000 in revenue, right? If I went all the way to capacity, if I was trying to get at 50,000, I'd have to go all the way down to $3. Well, 50,000 times 3 is only 150,000. That's a lot less, almost half the 296,000 I can get by charging $8 for that 37,000. right? So I'm not going to go beyond this point. I'm not going to go out here into the 40s where, guess what, my marginal revenue selling the tickets at these prices, $5 or so, means I lost all that extra money back here for these other fans, because now I'm charging them $5 when I could have been getting $8 out of them. Alright? So my max profit ends up being below capacity in this example. Alright? Does that make sense? It's kind of tricky. If you need to think about that again, you can obviously rewind this video, or you can go to the book and read them, kind of describe it. But the important thing to remember here is that as a monopolist, my marginal revenue curve ends up being below demand, or below the price that I'm charging. Okay? Alright. So let's talk about scalping for a minute here. So in the case of scalping, all of you are probably familiar with this term. We're talking about the secondary ticket market now. So let's stick with baseball. So the team has set some sort of a price ceiling, or sometimes Major League Baseball has set some sort of a price ceiling. And for certain games, the demand is going to be beyond that price ceiling. We see again supply is vertical here. In this case, we're talking about the quantity sold. It's vertical, meaning at any price here, we're only going to sell up to capacity. For certain games, the demand line at capacity could be above the price ceiling that it's set at. So here we have an equilibrium price at $100, but the price ceiling set by the team for this particular game is only at $15. We've got this huge gap here. This creates opportunity for scalpers. It's excess demand, right? People are willing to pay more than what the team is charging. So why would the team set a price ceiling so low? Well, there's a lot of different reasons depending on the situation. The most common is that because sports is so much a part of our society, we like to think about it as being accessible to the everyday person. And so sports teams can take a lot of heat from the media if they're charging too much, and it gets out of touch for everyday people to come in and watch games, right? So they typically, in some instance, will set prices at a little bit below what the equilibrium price might be by pure supply and demand. Also, we have the situation, like we just described, where they act as somewhat of a monopolist in a situation, and their marginal revenue line is lower than the actual demand line. So that creates this black market for tickets, or what could be called a gray market for tickets, depending on the laws in a particular state. So what about this idea that owners have to raise ticket prices because player salaries keep going up? You know, a team signs a big superstar to a huge contract and then raises prices and says, well, we wanted to keep the superstar, or we wanted to bring the superstar in, and so I've got to raise ticket prices. Well, there's somewhat of a fallacy to that. So if salaries go up, does the marginal cost of tickets go up? Is the cost of selling an additional ticket any more to that owner? No, not really, because tickets have hardly any variable cost at all, right? That additional ticket didn't cost that owner anything to sell for the most part until you get to capacity. So marginal cost doesn't really change with the signing of superstars. However, marginal revenue could shift demand to the right, right? Marginal revenue might shift. That superstar could shift demand to the right, meaning that marginal revenue shifts to the right. So let's think about professional sports here in terms of why it developed when it did. You know, we have a long history in this country going all the way back, of course, to the mid-1700s, but yet we didn't really have professional sports in the U.S. Same thing in the UK. In the United Kingdom, they didn't really have professional soccer until the mid-1800s. Baseball and professional soccer professional baseball and professional soccer developed around the same time. So why did this happen? Well, it's because of marginal utility and marginal cost. So for a long time we lived on subsistence economies where the marginal cost of an additional hour of leisure, even at 0 hours of leisure, the marginal cost of that leisure was higher than the marginal utility, was higher than what I got out of that hour of leisure, right? Because subsistence, by its very definition, meant that I was working to try and feed my family, and I had to pretty much work all the time to put food on the table and keep shelter over their heads. But then something happened in the UK that spread to the US immediately, the Industrial Revolution. And it changed us from a subsistence economy to one where our marginal cost of leisure time went down, right? No longer did I have to work all hours that I'm awake to try and provide for my family. Now the production of me as an individual and us as a society has increased to the point where I don't have to work every single hour. So now my marginal cost curve shifts down. Remember, technology is something that can shift that marginal cost curve down. And now I get a point out here beyond 0 when I'm willing to actually engage in some hours of leisure because the utility that I get from that leisure is greater than the cost that I give. And what do I do with that leisure? In some cases I play sports, or I'm willing to watch some professionals or some individuals play sports, and I'm willing to pay some of my money to watch that individual play sports. And entrepreneurs realized that this was the case and started professional teams. Of course, our own baseball team, the first professional baseball team in Cincinnati back in 1869, I believe, started that out. And there was no league at that point, so that team just barnstormed and went around to different communities and charged for people to come out and watch them play the local team, and that's how the players got paid. So here's an explanation of what I just described, right? All of your time is spent producing in a subsistence economy. If not, you die. That's a pretty big marginal cost of leisure. And so the marginal cost of leisure is higher than the marginal utility at all levels of leisure time, so the optimal amount of leisure is essentially 0. The Industrial Revolution changed that. The middle class expanded, and it created a condition because of the raised productivity where we had time and money to spend on sports. Hence, we get this situation where that working class participation in sports, both from a participatory aspect and a spectator aspect, created the conditions where professional sports could indeed arise. And we didn't have that before the mid-1800s. So essentially, professional sports developed out of the Industrial Revolution. And because Britain and the U.S. were on the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution, the front edge of that Industrial Revolution, we also see professional sports. The U.K. and the U.S. were at the front of that movement for professional sports. So that's the end of Chapter 2. The next video we'll talk about the appendix to Chapter 2, in which we will get into some budget constraints that we as consumers have, and we'll also do a quick review of regression.